We were wondering about the links between Thiel's technological investments, PayPal, Facebook on the one hand, and his anti-democratic tendencies and apocalyptic views. So let's start with his anti-democratic views. In 2009, Thiel openly stated that he no longer believes that freedom and democracy are compatible. Now, already early on, he identified as a ultra-conservative evangelical on the far right who felt very much ill at ease on a campus like Stanford, where he met Girard, and Stanford in the 90s was dominated by more leftist tendencies on campus. And so Peter Thiel co-founded Stanford Review, which is a review organized by students whose goal was to provide an alternative to the leftist, now Thiel would say woke, tendencies dominant in academia. Now, this ultra-conservative far-right tendency became exacerbated as Thiel decided to fund Trump's first election campaign in 2015 that led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Thiel even gave a speech at the Republican convention where he urged his fellow Americans to stand up and vote for Donald Trump, pointing out an identification between himself, Thiel, who is not a politician, but he builds things, and he argued that Trump is not a politician either and is building things, so making America great again. Now, at the same time, I should mention that Donald Trump was not unfamiliar with the problematic of mimesis. If he was not maybe familiar with the concept, he was familiar with the practice, because as a TV reality show host, he was putting in practice mimetic or dramatic strategies that are characteristics of the actor. And as we always stress in mimetic studies, the concept of mimesis in Greek comes from mimos, which means actor or performance. And as I've argued elsewhere in a book that I started writing in 2016, Donald Trump was very apt in putting mimetic mechanisms drawn from previous theories of imitation, like crowd psychology, for instance, to use in order to magnetize the crowds, so that we have in Donald Trump himself already a figure who has put the notion or the practice of mimesis to political use and abuse. In this book, I still used mimetic theory as a lens to critique Donald Trump, arguing that the triangles of mimetic rivalry and desires at play in his TV show The Apprentice are a perfect illustration of Girard's mimetic theory and the scapegoating mechanisms that ensue. But now I'm paying attention to the alternative perspective, that is how mimetic theory can be appropriated by the far right, by figures like Thiel and Trump, and be put to anti-democratic use. Now, in the second election of Donald Trump, you might remember that there were a number of CEOs of AI companies present at the inaugurations on the first row, but Thiel was missing. He wasn't present. And many have wondered, why wasn't Thiel present, given his unique stance in 2016 in supporting Donald Trump? And I haven't mentioned, but Thiel is a professional speed chess player. So he's a strategist of sort, and I would like to suggest that he was already planning his next move as Trump got re-elected. And this move has an interesting history. Thiel gave a talk at Yale back in 2011, and he basically relied on his knowledge of Girard's mimetic theory to speak about the logic of rivalry and competition among ambitious Yale students of law who are entering a very competitive environment in a very competitive Ivy League university. Now, in the audience in 2011 was a young and rather frustrated J.D. Vance, who was trying to adapt to Yale, to this context of competition, and also upper class. He was coming more for a working class background, and he was also reconsidering his Christian faith. And so I should mention that J.D. Vance, not unlike Donald Trump, but for different reasons, was in a way already skilled in mimetic strategies, specifically strategies of adaptation, and so he was likely to be receptive to the topic of imitation central to Thiel's lecture. Let me just tell you why. If you've read his autobiographical memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, he grew up in Kentucky, shuttling back and forth between Kentucky and Ohio in a very socially disadvantaged family with a missing father and an addicted mother, and so he had to navigate different father figures, he says. And I quote from the book, he says, "I had grown especially skillful at navigating various father figures. With Steve, a middle-life crisis sufferer with an earring to prove it, I pretended earrings were cool. So much so that he thought it appropriate to pierce my ear, too. With Chip, an alcoholic police officer who saw my earring as a sign of girliness, I had a thick skin and loved police cars. But none of these things were really true. I hated earrings. I hated police cars." Now notice here that it's not really mimetic desire in Girard's sense, since Vance didn't really desire earrings or police cars. It's rather a mimetic simulation or a mimicry, which is characteristic of what is diagnosed in mimetic studies as a form of mimicry. Here, a figure that is helpful to bring in addition to Girard, to understand Vance's chameleon strategy, is Friedrich Nietzsche, who had argued in his career that humans have a mimetic tendency that is accentuated in the case of class disadvantage, for instance, and it's at the origins of morality. And he establishes a comparison between animal mimicry, animals blending in their surroundings, and human mimicry blending in with dominant opinions. As he says in a book titled Daybreak, that just like animals adapt to the coloring of their surrounding, so the individual hides in the general concept of man or in society, or adapts himself to princes, classes, parties, opinions of his time and place. I'd like to suggest that as J.D. Vance is listening to Thiel, he is already a homo mimeticus well skilled in this kind of mimicry. And so, unsurprisingly, as Thiel presents Girard's mimetic theory, J.D. Vance is receptive to it. Vance says, "It captured so well the psychology of my generation, especially its most privileged inhabitants. Mired in the swamp of social media, we identify as a scapegoat and digitally pounced. We were keyboard warriors unloading on people via Facebook and Twitter." Now, Vance doesn't stop to consider that actually Thiel was partially responsible for the creation of social media like Facebook and Twitter that allow for precisely those scapegoating mechanisms. But he uses it as a mirror to look at his own mimetic drives and competitions and to operate a form of self-critique. Especially because he notices that in Thiel's speech there is a religious Christian dimension that echoes with his own Christian upbringing, which, as I mentioned, is reconnecting to. And so he says, I began to wonder where Thiel's religious belief came from, which led me to René Girard, the French philosopher whom he had apparently studied under at Stanford, as you know. So Vance says that it was the theory of the scapegoat and what it revealed about Christianity that made him reconsider his faith. So we can begin to understand the impact that Thiel, who is older than Vance, had on J.D. Vance. Vance called Thiel's lecture the most significant moment of his career at Yale as a law student. You could say that number one, he finds in Thiel a mentor, a father figure who is also will be his first employer at a company called Mithril. If you hear an echo from The Lord of the Rings, keep that in mind. It will remain important. But he also finds via Thiel as a mediator, in Girard's terminology, a theory about desire and rivalry that helps him navigate his own rivalrous and competitive life as a law student at Yale. It makes him reconcile his faith, and above all, though he didn't know it at the time, Vance finds in Thiel a sponsor, a major sponsor for entering politics. Thiel will donate a record-breaking $15 million to sponsor Vance's career as a senator, as he entered politics as a senator in Ohio. And he will later leverage Trump and use his influence on Trump to push Vance as vice president of the United States. So we can understand why, on the one hand, Vance says it's the most significant moment of his career. We can also see the kind of power that Thiel is deploying, not always while being in the foreground, so by being in the shadows, in order to have an impact on American politics and, by extension, world politics. Now, given this conversion to Christianity, we might wonder, specifically because René Girard's theory is critical of scapegoat mechanism, as Vance understood and recognizes, why Vance was complicit with the scapegoating theory that he actually helped spread, that Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio are eating their pets. This is a characteristic scapegoating racist mechanism that was used by Donald Trump during the presidential debate with Kamala Harris, and obviously it is a lie, and that's one of his strategies, but it is also a scapegoating mechanism directing violence against a minority that works in practice, despite the fact that it's an obvious lie. You might wonder about that, since Vance had said, that he converted to Catholicism, and Girard made him see the truth of mimetic rivalry and scapegoating. We might also remember that Vance was implicated directly, or actually triggered, this triangular rivalry that emerged during this visit by President Zelensky at the White House, which escalated, and it was indeed Vance who served as a figure who triggered that escalation, once again generating rivalry within a triangular structure. So we notice that in Girard we find a solution or an attempt to diagnose these strategies, whereas in Vance we find a figure who is actually putting mimetic theory to political abuse to generate the very mechanisms that mimetic theory critiques. Now, when pushed on these questions of the obvious lie of immigrants eating pets, Thiel replied with chilling hypocrisy, and I quote him, "If I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do." So he's fully conscious that this is a story, but he has no problems in turning the story into a scapegoating myth that generates real effects. That's why I've given you the definition of mimicry from Nietzsche, in which figures adapt to their surroundings, especially to the dominant opinion of people in power, like princes or wannabe kings. And so it is no accident that even though Vance was an avowed anti-Trumper, actually he went as far as comparing Trump to Hitler. He ends up sitting on his administration as vice president. Never Trump, for a mimetic chameleon, can mean always Trump. And we should also be very suspicious of his Catholic facade, of his conversion as he goes and visits two popes. then we should be careful to realize that behind the Catholic mask is a homo mimeticus who doesn't hesitate to put scapegoating mechanism to what I call new fascism abuse. I mentioned that Thiel is a professional chess player and that with Vance is planning his move. We can consider Vance not only a pawn but actually a Trojan horse in the sphere of politics. And we can imagine that a chameleon figure like Vance will have no problems in putting technologies to new fascist use or perhaps even apocalyptic abuse. Which leads me to the third part of this presentation.